Being a good neighbor, polite, amiable, but not overly familiar, was something Maya had always taken pride in. However, her determination began to waver when Dylan moved in next door. It was impossible to ignore him because of his effortless confidence and attractive demeanor. Although they spoke amicably at first, even informally, there was an underlying tension that was not expressed. It started out innocently enough. Maya would give him coffee when she saw him working on his terrace, or Dylan would wave while he mowed his yard. However, their laughing had a flair that felt everything but neighborly, and their chats usually seemed to go on for a bit too long. Maya heard Dylan's voice behind her one bright afternoon as she was tending to her flower bed. "My garden is nothing compared to yours." She turned to see his warm, playful smile as he leaned on the fence. Ignoring the flutter in her chest, she answered, "Perhaps you simply need a better gardener." He held her gaze for an excessive amount of time before saying, "Maybe." He pointed to her tangled hose, which was dripping water onto the grass, before she could reply. "Need assistance with that?" She hurriedly responded, "I got it," but he was already hopping the fence and getting closer to her with each step. The warmth of his presence made her heart race, and his closeness was disarming. "You see?" He squatted down to untangle the hose and replied, "Easy fix." Their faces were inches apart when he stood, and there was an electric charge in the air between them. Her voice was hardly heard as she said, "Thanks." "Any time," he said, his smile growing softer as he continued to stare at her mouth. Later that night, Maya was enjoying a glass of wine on her couch when she was startled by a knock at the door. Dylan was standing there with his hands stuffed in his pockets and a sheepish smile on his face as she opened it. "I apologize for disturbing you," he continued, "but I was wondering if you had a torch I could borrow because my power just went out." After a brief moment of hesitation, Maya moved aside. "Enter. Let me get it for you." Dylan strolled into the living room and looked at the book on the coffee table while she dug into a drawer. He held it up and said, "You're reading this?" "I adore this writer." "Really?" she exclaimed, startled. The majority of people aren't even familiar with him. His smile widened as he mocked, "I guess that makes me special." Maya gave him the torch while laughing. "This is yours." Dylan put the torch on the table instead of walking away, his face growing grim. "Maya," he murmured, "may I ask you a question?" She looked into his eyes, her heart racing. "Yes." His voice was hardly audible above a whisper when he questioned, "Do you feel it too?" She caught her breath and froze. "How do you feel?" "This," he said, taking a step forward. Whatever is going on between us, Dylan moved closer to her before she could respond, searching her eyes with his palm and grazing her cheek. With emotion in his voice, he whispered, "Tell me to stop." However, she didn't. Rather, as if testing the limits they were about to cross, she leaned into his touch and kissed him slowly and tentatively. As the kiss intensified, his hands moved to her waist and drew her in. As the heat between them increased, Maya's body pressed against his while her fingers knotted in his hair. "You're amazing," Dylan whispered in a hoarse voice against her lips. She muttered back, "And you're dangerous," her voice shaking with a mixture of need and dread. Dylan was still sleeping next to her, his arm around her waist, when Maya woke up as sunshine peeked through the curtains. Before the weight of reality hit, everything seemed ideal for a little period. Slipping out of bed, she sat on the edge of the couch and wrapped a blanket around herself. Dylan shifted, stretching and opening his eyes. "Good morning," he replied in a slumber-heavy voice. "Good morning," she said quietly, her mind racing. He sat up and stretched for her hand, his face growing serious. "No regrets?" Maya paused, her thoughts and emotions at odds. "I'm not sure," she said. "This was a surprise." He brushed his fingertip over her knuckles and replied, "Maybe." However, it felt natural. The sound of a car coming into the driveway cut off their chat. When Maya saw the car, her heart stopped. With a furrowed brow, Dylan questioned, "Who is that?" "My husband," Maya muttered in a terrified tone. Dylan's eyes widened, but her husband entered through the front door before he could react. His voice was light as he yelled out, "Hey! You won't believe what I've experienced today." His eyes narrowed as they fell on Dylan, and he froze as he stepped into the living room. His voice rose as he screamed, "What the hell is going on here?" Maya's mind raced for an explanation as her breath caught. Dylan, however, stood with a composed yet determined gaze as she opened her mouth to speak. "You're mistaken," Dylan stated firmly, "but I won't say I'm sorry for being here." Her husband's jaw tightened as his eyes moved between them. "You have 5 seconds to leave my house." With a quiet question in his gaze, Dylan turned to face Maya. As he walked away without saying anything more, she nodded, her heart heavy. Her husband turned to face her, his voice icy as the door shut behind him. "We must speak." As her husband's comments lingered in the air, Maya's throat constricted. Anger, betrayal, and confusion flickered in the depths of his eyes as they met hers. The moment's weight was bearing down on her as she stood motionless. "Maya," he repeated in a firm yet hushed voice, "what on earth is happening?" Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. How could she respond? The reality was too unvarnished and devastating. She said, her voice faltering. "I didn't intend for this to occur." Her husband's hands clenched at his sides as his jaw grew hard. "Did you not intend for this to occur? For me to enter our home and discover another man? In our bed?" She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "That wasn't the case. You underestimate how complicated it is." "Then give me an explanation," he said sternly, "because it's pretty damn simple from where I stand." With quivering palms, Maya slumped onto the couch to collect her thoughts. Her voice was hardly audible above a whisper as she confessed, "I've been lonely. You're constantly working and preoccupied. Sometimes I feel like I don't even exist in your eyes." Her husband's tone stayed reserved, but his face softened a little. "So that's your justification? You turned to the guy next door because you were lonely." Her voice cracked as she hurriedly stated, "It's not an excuse. I'm merely attempting to describe how I got here. I didn't mean to hurt you, and I didn't intend for this to occur." He shook his head and laughed bitterly. "You didn't intend to cause me harm? Do you know what it's like to come home and discover that your wife has been deceiving you, Maya? To witness another man leaving our home?" "I understand," she murmured, her eyes welling up with tears. "And I really apologize. This is not what I ever wanted." As he absorbed her remarks, her husband walked the room and ran a hand through his hair. At last, he paused and looked at her. He whispered, "You know what hurts the most? You were not with him, that's for sure. The reason is because you didn't approach me. You didn't disclose your difficulties to me." She said in a broken voice, "I didn't think you'd care. For a very long time we have been so far apart. I had no idea how to get in touch with you." His shoulders slumped as he let out a deep breath. "Maya, I'm not flawless. I apologize. I realize I have been preoccupied, but I'm concerned. I have always been concerned." Her heart ached as she gazed up at him. "Now what do we do?" The tense stillness was broken when the doorbell rang before her husband could respond. As they looked at each other, Maya's stomach fell. With a cautious tone, he questioned, "Who could that be?" She answered in a shaky voice, "I don't know." Her husband approached the door and opened it slowly. Dylan stood on the porch with a determined yet nervous look on his face. Her spouse remarked, "You've got some nerve," in a chilly tone. Dylan stated in a composed yet determined tone, "I'm not here to cause trouble. I simply couldn't let things like that go." Dylan entered, his eyes darting to Maya's, and her heart began to rush. His voice was firm as he said, "I apologize for what happened. However, I can't act as though Maya and I didn't share anything real." Her husband squinted his eyes. "True? Do you think it's real to sneak around with my wife?" Dylan stated unequivocally, "It wasn't sneaking." "It wasn't about you either. Her needs are at the center of this." Her husband's jaw tightened as he turned to face her, and tension crackled in the air. "Maya, what is this? Are you picking him instead of me?" "I don't know," she admitted candidly, her voice shaking. "I'm not sure what I want at the moment." Her husband's face became stern. Well, he continued quietly, "You'd better figure it out, because I will not stand here and defend someone who is unsure of their desire for me." Maya hid her face in her palms and let her tears fall. "This is unfair," she remarked in a hushed tone. "I never intended to cause harm to anyone." Dylan anchoring his presence, he took a step closer. Then he urged quietly, "Don't make any decisions tonight. Take as much time as you require." Her husband shook his head and mocked. "It's simple for you to say. You stand to gain nothing." Dylan looked him in the eye equally. "You're mistaken," he muttered. "I'm concerned about her. I stand to lose everything as a result." The tension subsided as the night went on, and a tenuous ceasefire took its place. In order to give Maya the much-needed space, her husband consented to spend a few days with a friend. His voice was full of quiet sadness as he turned to her before leaving. "Maya, you are loved. I hope you keep that in mind." Dylan remained after he left, sitting with him in the living room and providing constant solace. He didn't press or ask for clarification. With his palm softly on hers, he just listened. "You underestimate your strength," he remarked quietly. "Whatever occurs, you will overcome this." Maya felt a glimmer of optimism, a faint but genuine one, as the first rays of morning peeked through the windows. Although she had no idea what was ahead, she felt prepared to face it for the first time in a long time. Dylan remained seated across from Maya, his hand lightly touching hers. And the living room was silent. Even though the night was still tense, there was a simmering, unsaid emotion between them. Her husband had just departed, and she could still feel the weight of his final words. "I hope you remember that I love you." As Maya gazed at Dylan, her chest constricted. His dark eyes, steady and unflinching, searched hers. He whispered, "You don't have to say anything, but for anything you need, I'm here." Her fingers curled around his as she let out a shaky gasp. "I need to feel like myself again," she said, her voice shaking. Dylan's eyes grew softer as he lightly squeezed her hand. "Maya, you've always been enough," he remarked in a quiet but firm voice. "You simply forgot." His words caused her breath to catch, and she naturally leaned in closer to him. There was no denying the intensity of his presence or the warmth of his touch. She knew she didn't want to fight it any longer when his hand moved to her cheek and wiped away a stray tear. The slow, gentle kiss between Dylan's lips and hers soon intensified the fire within. As though he were the only thing keeping her rooted in the craziness of the night, Maya's hands moved to his shoulders and gripped him. His fingertips traced the curve of her jaw and then moved to her waist in a purposeful stroke. With a voice full of emotion, he said, "Maya," against her lips. "Are you certain?" Her response was evident in the way she leaned back into him and kissed him again, pulling back just enough to see his gaze. She said, "I've never been more certain." As their kiss grew more intense, Dylan stood up and effortlessly lifted her into his arms. They moved with ease and unbridled need as he carried her over to the couch. The room was filled with the sound of their murmured names and mingled breaths as the lamp's gentle illumination created shadows on their entwined bodies. The faint sound of footfall outside halted them both just as their desire was at its height. Maya's pulse pounded as she looked out the window, where her husband's figure was clearly visible as he walked towards the door. "What is he doing back?" she said in a panicked whisper. Dylan's face changed, displaying a mixture of resolve and frustration. "He's putting you to the test," he said. "Remain here. I'll take care of it." Dylan straightened out his shirt and headed for the door before Maya could object. Her husband was about to knock when he opened it. "Why are you in this place?" Dylan's tone was stern but calm as he inquired. Her husband's eyes squinted as they darted from Dylan to the dark living room behind him. His voice was tense as he added, "I forgot my wallet. I assumed I would grab it." Dylan remained motionless, his posture uncompromising. He stepped back into the house and shut the door after saying, "I'll get it for you." He turned to face Maya, who was motionless with a racing heart. "Where is it?" Dylan whispered. "On the counter," she said in a scarcely audible whisper. Without saying anything, Dylan took the wallet and went back to the door to give it to the person. Her husband's eyes followed him, distrust engraved on his face, but he accepted it and turned to go without saying anything. With an unreadable expression, Dylan locked the door and faced Maya once more. "Are you all right?" he inquired quietly. Her breath was erratic as she nodded. She said, "Without you, I don't know what I would have done." Taking 2 steps across the room, Dylan drew her into his embrace. He brushed her temple with his lips and remarked, "You're stronger than you think. You don't have to do this alone, though." It was impossible to ignore his presence or his comments. Rekindling the heat between them, Maya drew him closer and kissed him. There was no doubt or second-guessing this time. As they gave in to the bond that had been growing between them the entire time, the burden of the night vanished. When Maya woke up, Dylan's arm was wrapped over her in a protective manner as the daylight shone through the windows. she experienced clarity and a glimmer of optimism for the future for the first time in months. Although she was aware that the path ahead would not be simple, she realized she was no longer terrified as she gazed at Dylan, whose serene demeanor reminded her of the guy who had supported her throughout the storm. She was prepared to face whatever lay ahead, one step at a time.